Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases of landlord exploitation and serial murder in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will disturb you in a way few other accounts can, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of how easily evil can hide behind the facade of ordinary commerce. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned decades in the industrial heart of Ohio, where one man transformed the American dream of property ownership into something unspeakably dark, defied all expectations of human decency, and left a legacy so horrifying that entire neighborhoods still bear the psychological scars of his depravity. It was the year 1989. The Berlin Wall was falling, the Cold War was ending, America was entering a new era of optimism and prosperity. But in Cleveland, Ohio, the situation was starkly different. The Rust Belt was rusting. Steel mills that once thundered with the promise of the American working class now stood silent, their skeletal frames reaching toward gray skies like monuments to economic decay. In neighborhoods like Mount Pleasant and Kinsman, entire blocks of houses stood vacant, their windows broken, their porches sagging, their yards overgrown with weeds that seemed to thrive where hope had died. This was a landscape of abandonment, of forgotten people in forgotten places, where the vulnerable sought shelter wherever they could find it, and where predators understood that the disappeared would not be missed. Among the boarded-up buildings and crumbling infrastructure, one man was accumulating properties with remarkable efficiency. He wasn't a developer with grand visions of revitalization. He wasn't a community activist trying to restore dignity to neglected neighborhoods. He was something far more insidious, a landlord who understood that desperation makes people invisible, and that invisibility creates opportunity for those without conscience. His name was Anthony Sowell. But before we speak that name in the context of the horrors he would commit, we must understand the world that made his crimes possible. We must walk through those decaying streets, feel the cold wind that swept across abandoned lots where children once played, understand the economic collapse that transformed proud communities into hunting grounds, because this is not simply a story about one monster. This is a story about the systems that allow monsters to flourish, about the way poverty, addiction, and social neglect create perfect conditions for predation, about how easily human beings can vanish when society has already decided they don't matter. The bodies would eventually be found. 11 women, decomposing in various states within a single house, hidden in crawl spaces, wrapped in plastic, buried in shallow graves in the backyard. But by the time investigators made their grotesque discovery in October 2009, Anthony Sowell had been operating with impunity for years. The question that haunts every examination of this case is not simply how one man could kill so many. It's how he could do so while neighbors complained of terrible smells, while women went missing from the same small radius, while a community cried out for attention that never came. This is the story of the evil landlord who kept bodies in his rental properties. But more than that, it's the story of 11 women whose lives mattered, whose disappearances should have triggered immediate action, and whose deaths reveal uncomfortable truths about which lives our society deems worthy of protection. Cleveland's East Side in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a study in systematic disinvestment. Mount Pleasant, once a thriving working-class neighborhood of neat single, family homes and corner stores, had been hollowed out by white flight, redlining, and the collapse of the manufacturing sector that had sustained its residents for generations. Imperial Avenue, where our story centers, ran through the heart of this decline. A street that had once bustled with activity, children playing stickball, neighbors calling to each other from front porches, corner stores doing brisk business, had transformed into something resembling a war zone, not from bombs, but from something equally destructive: economic abandonment. The houses along Imperial Avenue were mostly wood, frame structures built in the early 20th century. Victorian-style homes with ornate trim that had long since peeled away. Front yards that had once been carefully tended now grew wild with thistle and ragweed. Many homes were vacant, their windows broken by vandals or boarded with plywood that bore spray-painted warnings, "No trespassing" and "Condemned." But people still lived here. People who had nowhere else to go. People for whom even these deteriorating structures represented shelter from the elements and the streets. The vulnerable, the addicted, the mentally ill, the working poor barely hanging onto stability. Women, primarily African American women, who had been pushed to the margins of society by forces far larger than themselves. In neighborhoods like this, landlords operated with minimal oversight. Building inspections were rare. Complaints went unanswered. The city had bigger problems, or so the logic went. And so properties exchanged hands between slumlords who understood that the desperate cannot afford to be choosy, who knew that tenants living on society's edge couldn't demand their legal rights. This was the ecosystem into which Anthony Sowell inserted himself. Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1950, in East Cleveland. His childhood was marked by instability and trauma. A common origin story for those who later commit terrible acts, though of course millions endure similar childhoods without becoming predators. His mother struggled with alcoholism. His family life was chaotic. He witnessed domestic violence. He experienced abuse. These facts do not excuse what he would later do. They merely provide context for how certain personalities are forged in crucibles of dysfunction. By his early 20s, Sowell had joined the United States Marine Corps. He served from 1978 to 1985, achieving the rank of corporal. His military record was unremarkable, neither exemplary nor disgraceful. He learned discipline, he learned skills, and in 1985 he received an honorable discharge. What happened after his discharge is crucial to understanding the timeline of his crimes. In June 1989, Sowell was arrested for attempted rape. A 24-year-old pregnant woman had accepted a ride from him. Instead of taking her to her destination, he drove to a wooded area, punched her repeatedly in the stomach, and attempted to sexually assault her. She fought him off and escaped. This was not the opportunistic crime of a moment's poor judgment. This was calculated, predatory, a glimpse of what lay beneath his surface. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served the entirety of his sentence, unusual in an era when parole was common, because he was considered an uncooperative prisoner who showed no remorse. He was released in June 2005, labeled as a registered sex offender, and he returned to Imperial Avenue. 12205 Imperial Avenue was an unremarkable house on an unremarkable block. 2 stories. Wood siding painted a fading gray, a small front porch with sagging steps, a narrow driveway leading to a detached garage in back. The kind of structure that had housed working families for decades, where children had grown up, where Sunday dinners had been served, where life's ordinary rituals had played out. Anthony Sowell moved into the upstairs apartment of this duplex in 2005, shortly after his release from prison. His stepmother, Sojourner Sowell, owned the property and lived in the downstairs unit. This arrangement was common in neighborhoods like Mount Pleasant, elderly homeowners supplementing fixed incomes by renting out portions of their properties, often to family members. Sejourna was elderly and in declining health. She spent much of her time inside her ground floor apartment, her mobility limited, her awareness of what transpired upstairs constrained by physical limitations and perhaps by a willful determination not to know, because from 2007 onward, something terrible was happening in that house. The first victim, though we would not know this until much later, was Crystal Dozier, 35 years old, mother of 8 children, struggling with drug addiction but loved fiercely by her family. She was last seen in May 2007. Her family filed a missing persons report. They posted flyers. They searched the neighborhood. They begged police to investigate more thoroughly. But Crystal fit a profile that authorities have historically failed to protect. A black woman with a history of drug use, living in a high-crime area. Her disappearance was noted, filed, and then nothing. This pattern would repeat itself, again and again and again. Let us speak their names. Let us honor them as individuals, not statistics, because each was a person with dreams, with family, with a story that mattered. Crystal Dozier, last seen May 2007, age 35, mother of 8. Her children waited for her to come home. She never did. Lashanda Long, last seen September 2008, age 25. She had a bright smile in her photographs. Young, full of life that should have stretched decades ahead. Michelle Mason, last seen October 2008, age 45. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who mattered. Kim Yvette Smith, last seen January 2009, age 44. Her family would later describe her as kind-hearted, always willing to help others even when she herself struggled. Nancy Cobbs, last seen April 2009, age 43, beloved aunt. Her nieces and nephews remember her laugh. Amelia Hunter, last seen April 2009, age 47, known in the neighborhood for her distinctive style, her bright clothing that defied the gray surroundings. Talasha Fortson, last seen June 2009, age 31, vibrant, young, gone. Janice Webb, last seen June 2009, age 48, mother, friend, human being whose absence left a hole in the world. Tonia Carmichael, last seen November 2008, age 52. She had survived decades of hardship. She should have survived longer. Diane Turner, last seen September 2009, age 38. Her family celebrated her life even as they mourned her death. And one more victim whose identity remains unknown even today. A Jane Doe, a woman so marginalized that even her name was lost. She deserves to be counted, to be remembered. Even if we cannot speak her name, 11 women, 11 lives, all disappeared from the same small radius of Cleveland's East Side between 2007 and 2009. All fit a similar profile. African American women, most struggling with addiction, most engaged in survival sex work, all living in the shadowy spaces of extreme poverty. Their families reported them missing, posted flyers with their photographs, organized search parties. But the response from authorities was tepid at best, dismissive at worst. Why? The uncomfortable truth is that these women existed in a space our society has designated as disposable. Drug addiction transforms human beings into cautionary tales rather than deserving victims. Poverty places people beyond the circle of those deemed worthy of protection. And race, let us be unflinchingly honest, has always determined whose missing daughter generates front-page headlines and whose generates a case number filed away in an overburdened system. But there were warnings, there were signs, there were people who knew something was wrong. The smell began sometime in 2008. Neighbors on Imperial Avenue started complaining about a terrible odor emanating from 12205. It was not the ordinary unpleasantness of a neighborhood in decline, the smell of garbage or urban decay. This was something else, something organic, something rotting. The smell was so pervasive, so overwhelming, that residents began calling the city. They filed complaints with the health department. They reported it to police. They pleaded for someone to investigate. And the city did respond by blaming a nearby sausage factory. Ray's Sausage Company sat just down the street from Sowell's house. It was a convenient scapegoat. City officials attributed the smell to the factory's rendering process, to the disposal of animal waste, to industrial processes that occasionally produced unpleasant odors in the surrounding area. The factory's owner, Ray Cash, found himself in the bizarre position of being blamed for a smell that had nothing to do with his business. He complied with increased inspections. He modified his processes. He did everything asked of him, and still the complaints continued because the smell wasn't coming from his factory at all. It was coming from 12205 Imperial Avenue, where human bodies were decomposing in crawl spaces and shallow graves. How could trained investigators not recognize the smell of decomposing human remains? The answer is both simple and damning. They weren't looking. When complaints come from a neighborhood already dismissed as beyond saving, when the people making those complaints lack social capital, when the default assumption is that poor black neighborhoods simply smell bad, then investigations remain superficial. The smell continued. The women continued to disappear. And Anthony Sowell continued to operate with impunity, his registered sex offender status requiring only that he report his address once a year, a requirement he dutifully fulfilled, signing in at the sheriff's office with the address where he was murdering and storing bodies. On September 22, 2009, a woman named Latondra Billups accepted an invitation to visit Anthony Sowell's home. She knew him casually from the neighborhood. He seemed friendly, harmless. He offered her beer and the promise of casual company. She climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment. The smell inside was overpowering, but she had been around enough urban decay to dismiss it as the ordinary unpleasantness of poverty. Besides, Sowell was charming, attentive. He put her at ease, and then he attacked her. He punched her with savage force, strangled her until consciousness slipped away. She later recounted that she believed she was dying, that darkness was closing in, that this was the end. But something inside her refused to surrender. She fought back with desperate strength. She screamed. She clawed at his face, and somehow through fortune or sheer will, she managed to break free. She ran from the house, stumbling down the stairs, bursting into the street, screaming for help. Neighbors saw her. Police were called. She was taken to the hospital with serious injuries, bruising to her face and neck, trauma to her throat from strangulation, the psychological devastation of near death. She told police what had happened. She identified her attacker. She pressed charges. And then the criminal justice system did what it so often does to women, particularly women of color, particularly women with histories that make them imperfect victims. It delayed. The case wound through preliminary hearings. A trial was scheduled for November. Anthony Sowell remained free on bond, free to walk the streets, free to return to his house on Imperial Avenue, where bodies lay hidden, where evidence of serial murder was literally decomposing around him. 1 month, that's all the time that remained before investigators would finally, belatedly, discover the truth. On October 29, 2009, investigators from the Cleveland Sex Crimes Unit arrived at 12205 Imperial Avenue with a warrant. They were following up on the under Billup's assault case. The warrant authorized them to search Sowell's apartment, to collect evidence, to photograph the scene. It was supposed to be a routine evidence collection, a sexual assault case. Serious, certainly, but within the normal parameters of criminal investigation. What they discovered instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Detective Sergeant Mel Smith was among the first to enter the second-floor apartment. A veteran investigator with decades of experience, he had seen crime scenes that would traumatize civilians. He thought himself prepared for whatever awaited inside. Nothing could have prepared him for this. The smell hit first. Not the vague odor neighbors had complained about, filtered through distance and diluted by open air. This was concentrated, overwhelming, the unmistakable stench of death so powerful it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against the senses like something solid. Experienced investigators know that smell. There is nothing else like decomposing human remains. Once encountered, it cannot be forgotten, cannot be mistaken for anything else. The apartment itself was cluttered, but not unusually so for someone living in poverty. Furniture that had seen better decades. Walls that needed painting. Personal effects scattered about with the randomness of solitary living. But everywhere, on every surface, permeating every corner, that smell. Smith and his team began searching. Methodically, professionally, fighting against the gag reflex that threatened to overwhelm them. In the living room, beneath a rug, they found a section of floor that seemed unstable. They pulled back the covering. Beneath, the floorboards had been partially removed, revealing a crawl space. Detective Smith shone his flashlight into the darkness below. The beam illuminated something pale, something that in the first moment of recognition the brain refuses to accept. Something wrapped in plastic sheeting, human, shaped, the outline of a body clear even through the covering. "We have a body," Smith radioed to the command post outside, but it was not a body, it was bodies, plural. As the investigation expanded, as more officers arrived, as the entire house became an active crime scene, the full scope of the horror revealed itself piece by piece, room by room, like some nightmarish archaeological dig, where each layer uncovered something more disturbing than the last. 2 bodies in the crawl space beneath the living room floor, wrapped in plastic garbage bags and duct tape, partially decomposed, the remains of what had been living, breathing women reduced to evidence in a criminal investigation. Another body in a second crawl space, this one accessed through a hole in the third-floor ceiling. The third floor really just an unfinished attic space with exposed rafters and rough wooden flooring had been transformed into a tomb. More bodies in shallow graves in the backyard. The small plot of land behind the house, where neighbors had occasionally seen Sowell digging, where the smell had been particularly intense during summer months when heat accelerated decomposition. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs, ground, penetrating radar. They excavated carefully, treating each discovery with the reverence owed to human remains, even as the sheer number of victims threatened to overwhelm protocol. The garage yielded more remains, a detached structure that neighbors had watched Sowell enter and exit countless times, never suspecting what lay inside. By the time the search concluded, investigators had recovered 11 bodies. 11 women who had disappeared over a span of 3 years, whose families had reported them missing, who had vanished from the same small radius of Cleveland's east side while living their lives just blocks from where their bodies lay hidden. The discovery at 12205 Imperial Avenue triggered one of the largest criminal investigations in Cleveland's history. The house itself became a contained universe of forensic examination. Every surface was photographed. Every item catalogued, every fiber, every hair, every trace of biological evidence collected and analyzed. The bodies were transported to the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Frank Miller and his team faced the grim task of identification. Decomposition had rendered several victims difficult to identify visually. Dental records were compared, DNA samples taken. Families waited in agony for confirmation that their missing daughters, sisters, mothers were among the dead. The causes of death were largely consistent: ligature strangulation. Sowell had strangled his victims, typically from behind, using his hands or a ligature to compress their necks until death resulted from asphyxiation. Some showed signs of sexual assault. Some showed evidence of prolonged torture. All had suffered terror in their final moments. As identifications were confirmed, investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing timelines. When was each woman last seen? Where? With whom? What patterns emerged? The pattern was chilling in its consistency. All of the victims had been in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood shortly before their disappearances. Several had been seen with or near Anthony Sowell. Several had known him, at least casually. He was a presence in the neighborhood, someone who offered food, shelter, drugs, or money to vulnerable women. He had been hunting in his own backyard, building trust, exploiting vulnerability, and then murdering with impunity. Investigators also discovered that Sowell fit the profile of an organized serial killer. He planned his attacks. He controlled his crime scenes. He took steps to conceal evidence, wrapping bodies carefully, hiding them in spaces he had prepared. The house on Imperial Avenue wasn't just a residence. It was a carefully maintained killing ground. When investigators arrived at Imperial Avenue on October 29th, Anthony Sowell was not home. His whereabouts were unknown, and with each hour that passed, the urgency of apprehending him increased. An arrest warrant was issued. His photograph, a mug shot from his previous sex offense conviction, was broadcast across local media. Within hours, his face was on every news channel, every website, every newspaper in Northeast Ohio. The public was warned that Sowell was dangerous, potentially armed, definitely violent. Anyone with information about his whereabouts was urged to contact police immediately. For 2 days, Sowell evaded capture. Where he went, how he moved through the city undetected despite his face being everywhere, remains partially mysterious. He later claimed he had seen the news coverage, knew he was being sought, and simply walked around, bought food, slept in abandoned buildings, moved through the city's forgotten spaces like the ghost he had already become. On October 30, first Halloween, appropriately enough, Sowell was spotted near Mount Pleasant. A patrol officer recognized him and called for backup. Within minutes, multiple units converged. Sowell did not resist. He did not run. He simply stopped walking and allowed himself to be handcuffed, his expression, according to witnesses, strangely calm. Almost relieved, he was transported to Cleveland Police Headquarters and placed in an interrogation room. He waived his right to an attorney. He agreed to speak, and he confessed. Detective Rick Driscoll conducted the interrogation. Experienced, methodical, he activated the recording equipment and began with standard questions: name, address, understanding of rights. And then, "Anthony, we need to talk about what we found at your house." Sowell nodded. "I know what you found. Tell me about it." What followed was hours of confession, delivered in a tone that investigators later described as eerily detached. Sowell spoke about the murders the way someone might describe a mundane routine, factually, chronologically, without apparent emotion. He described meeting women in the neighborhood, inviting them to his apartment, offering beer, drugs, companionship, building a rapport before attacking suddenly, violently, overwhelming them before they could effectively resist. He described strangling them, feeling their struggles weaken, watching life leave their eyes. And then, and this detail chilled investigators to their core, he described keeping their bodies in his living space for days before hiding them, living alongside corpses, eating meals in rooms where death lingered. When asked why, Sowell offered explanations that felt both calculated and hollow: anger at women, sexual gratification from control and violence, a sense that these particular victims, poor, addicted, marginalized, wouldn't be missed. On this last point, he had been proven devastatingly correct. He had murdered 11 women over 3 years in a house where neighbors complained about the smell, where family members searched for missing loved ones, where a registered sex offender lived under official supervision, and yet no one had discovered his crimes until he attacked a woman who survived to report him. The confession was legally sufficient for prosecution. It contained details only the killer could know. It would be corroborated by physical evidence, by DNA matches between victims and samples from the house, by the archaeological record of horror that 12205 Imperial Avenue had become. The case against Anthony Sowell went to trial in June 2011, nearly 2 years after the discoveries at Imperial Avenue. The delay was necessary. Forensic analysis takes time, especially in cases of this magnitude. Prosecutors had to build an ironclad case for each murder charge. The trial was held in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court, with Judge Dick Ambrose presiding. Prosecutor Pinky Carr led the state's case, arguing that Sowell was a calculated, remorseless serial killer who had hunted vulnerable women with predatory patience. The defense, led by attorneys Rufus Sims and John Parker, faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was damning. The only hope was to argue against the death penalty by presenting mitigating factors: childhood trauma, mental illness, military service. The trial lasted weeks. Testimony was heartbreaking. Families of the victims took the stand to describe their loved ones not as statistics or victim numbers, but as human beings. Mothers who had loved their children, sisters who had shared confidences, women who had struggled but who had still possessed dignity, still deserved life. Lat Andra Billups testified about her attack, reliving her near-death experience before a courtroom packed with spectators and media. Her courage was remarkable. Her testimony was crushing. Forensic experts described the conditions in which bodies were found. Medical examiners testified about causes of death. DNA analysts confirmed identifications. Each piece of evidence built an inescapable conclusion. Anthony Sowell had murdered at least 11 women and concealed their bodies in and around his residence. The defense presented witnesses who described Sowell's abusive childhood, his military service, his struggles with alcohol. Expert witnesses testified about potential mental health issues, about the effects of trauma on brain development. None of it mattered. The evidence was too substantial, the crimes too horrific. On July 22, 2011, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: 11 counts of aggravated murder, 11 counts of kidnapping, 11 counts of abuse of a corpse, plus attempted murder and rape charges related to Lat Andra Billups and other survivors. The penalty phase began immediately. Would Sowell receive life in prison or death? For days, the jury heard arguments. The prosecution presented aggravating circumstances: multiple victims, torture, the targeting of vulnerable individuals. The defense pleaded for mercy, arguing that execution would not bring back the victims. that life in prison would serve justice adequately. On August 10, 2011, the jury recommended death. Judge Ambrose accepted the recommendation and sentenced Anthony Sowell to death by lethal injection, along with consecutive life sentences on other charges. In pronouncing sentence, Judge Ambrose addressed Sowell directly. "You have been convicted of terrible crimes, crimes that have devastated families and shocked this community. The jury has recommended, and I concur, that the appropriate punishment is death." Sowell showed no visible reaction. He was transported to Ohio's death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution to await execution. The discovery of 11 bodies at 12205 Imperial Avenue sent shockwaves through Cleveland and beyond. How could this have happened? How could a registered sex offender murder repeatedly in a residential neighborhood while authorities remained oblivious? The recriminations began immediately. Cleveland Police Chief Michael McGrath faced intense criticism for the department's failure to investigate the missing women more thoroughly. Families demanded answers. Why weren't reports taken seriously? Why was the smell attributed to a sausage factory rather than investigated? Why did it take an assault survivor's courage to finally trigger the investigation that should have happened years earlier? The uncomfortable truth was that systemic failures had enabled Sowell's killing spree. The failure to value the lives of poor black women. The failure to investigate thoroughly in marginalized neighborhoods. The failure to connect missing persons reports that showed obvious patterns. The failure of a sex offender supervision system that required only annual check-ins. Civil lawsuits followed. Families of the victims sued the city, arguing that negligence had allowed preventable murders. Some cases were settled. Others were dismissed. The legal battles dragged on for years, adding to the trauma already endured. The house itself became a symbol of horror. After the investigation concluded, after evidence was collected, after the property was no longer needed for prosecution, the city demolished 12205 Imperial Avenue. In February 2012, heavy equipment reduced the structure to rubble. Neighbors gathered to watch, some crying, some praying, all relieved to see physical evidence of nightmare erased from their street. A vacant lot remains today. Grass grows where bodies once lay hidden. Nothing marks the spot, no memorial. No plaque, just emptiness where horror once lived. But demolishing a building doesn't demolish questions. And many remain unanswered. The 11th victim, the Jane Doe whose identity was never confirmed, haunts investigators still. Who was she? Does a family somewhere still wait for a daughter who will never return? How did she become so marginalized that even her name was lost? There are also questions about whether 11 victims represents the true total. Sowell committed his first known sexual assault in 1989. He was imprisoned from then until 2005. But before that assault, were there earlier victims? And after his release, before the murders investigators documented, were there others? Some investigators believe the answer is yes. That 11 represents only what was discovered at Imperial Avenue. That other victims may lie in other locations, their disappearances attributed to the general chaos of life on society's margins. Sowell himself offered no clarity. In prison interviews, he alternately confessed, recanted, hinted at more victims, then denied everything. He seemed to take perverse pleasure in maintaining mystery, in controlling the narrative even from death row. On February 8, 2021, Anthony Sowell died in prison, not from execution. His appeals were still pending, the legal process grinding slowly forward. He died from natural causes, a terminal illness that took him before the state could. He was 61 years old. His death brought no closure to families who had waited years for justice. Some expressed relief that he was gone. Others felt cheated that he had avoided execution, that he had died on his own terms rather than the state's. The story of Anthony Sowell and the horrors of 12205 Imperial Avenue remains a disturbing reminder that evil flourishes in the spaces where society stops looking. That when we decide certain neighborhoods don't matter, certain people don't matter, certain lives don't merit full protection and investigation, we create conditions where predators can operate with impunity. 11 women died because systems failed them, not just one system, multiple interlocking systems of neglect. Economic systems that abandoned entire communities, law enforcement systems that allocated resources based on property values rather than human value, social service systems overwhelmed and underfunded, media systems that covered missing white women exhaustively while missing women of color generated barely a paragraph. Each victim had a name, had family, had a life that mattered beyond the circumstances of her death. They were not statistics, they were not symbols. They were Crystal, Lashanda, Michelle, Kim, Nancy, Amelda, Talacia, Janice, Tonia, Diane. They were human beings who deserved protection, who deserved investigation when they disappeared, who deserved justice. But questions remain that will likely never be fully answered. How many other victims were there? Not just Sowell's, but victims of other predators who understood, as he clearly did, that certain populations exist in zones of social invisibility where crimes go unnoticed. How many women are missing right now from neighborhoods like Mount Pleasant? How many disappearances are attributed to lifestyle choices, rather than investigated as potential crimes? How many complaints about suspicious circumstances are dismissed because they originate from communities already written off as beyond saving? These questions should disturb us, should make us uncomfortable, should force examination of assumptions we'd rather not confront. To this day, the Mount Pleasant neighborhood bears scars from Sowell's crimes. Property values that were already depressed plummeted further. Families moved away, unable to live with memories of horror. The neighborhood's reputation, already struggling, became synonymous with one of Cleveland's darkest chapters. But residents who remained worked to reclaim their community, to insist that they were more than one man's crimes, to honor the victims by building something better from the ruins. Community gardens now grow where vacant lots once stood. Neighbor watch programs maintain vigilance, and crucially, residents speak loudly and persistently when someone goes missing, refusing to let disappearances be dismissed. And on silent nights, when the wind sweeps across that vacant lot on Imperial Avenue, when shadows lengthen and the past feels achingly present, people still report an uneasiness, a sense that something terrible happened here, that the ground itself remembers. The evil landlord is gone. The house is demolished, but the lessons remain, the memories persist. And the imperative to do better, to val you all lives equally, to investigate thoroughly regardless of neighborhood or circumstances, to refuse to look away when the vulnerable need protection, that imperative remains as urgent as ever. If this journey through one of Cleveland's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the uncomfortable questions it raises about whose lives we value and protect, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined not just for their shock value, but for the truths they reveal about our society and ourselves. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it challenged you to think differently about crime, justice, and the systems that enable both. And comment sharing your perspectives on how we can build communities where everyone, regardless of economic status, addiction history, race, or circumstances, receives equal protection and equal justice. The victims of Anthony Sowell deserved better than they received in life. We honor their memory by ensuring that their deaths serve as a catalyst for change, that the failures that enabled their murders are corrected, that no future predator finds such fertile hunting ground in our neglected spaces. Until next time, may we all work toward a world where no one is invisible, where no one is disposable, where every missing person triggers immediate and thorough investigation, and where the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's life never determines the vigor with which society seeks justice on their behalf.